I'm going to start in on the locomotive. First step obviously is going to be to take the locomotive shell off. Now under this shell, the entire firebox and backhead area is filled with a very large Pitman motor. That motor is very tight in with the wires in there. So as part of the installation of the locomotive, I'm going to substitute some of the heavy wire and large connectors that they have for thinner wire and small connectors, and I'll explain everything I'm doing as we go. In case you hadn't noticed it in the first part of this, dealing with the tender, I'm working on a piece of about 2-inch thick foam here. This is going to be very important to be working on a soft surface when you do deal with the locomotive and all of its very, very fine details so that nothing gets damaged. So on to taking off the locomotive shell. Now the first thing you'll have to remove are these two small Phillips head screws. They are under the back of the locomotive, under the deck plate for the cab. They attach the back wall of the cab to the very, very stout brass frame of the locomotive. They come apart with a miniature Phillips head screwdriver like the one you see here, and this is very straightforward. No rocket science here. At the forward end of the locomotive, we want to remove the screw that's hidden in this central hole in the cylinder block. You don't want to remove this screw or that screw. You want to take out the one that's buried deep inside this central hole. Now it's a Phillips head screw, but it's not a miniature Phillips head screw. It looks to be a number 0 or a number 1, just like these screws that you can see. Now these holes are normally hidden behind the pilot truck, so the pilot truck has to be moved up and out of their way. So again, fairly simple. It's the screw in the central hole. Once these 3 screws, the 2 at the rear and this one in the central hole here, are removed, the locomotive shell will lift off. You may have to be very careful in working it off over that large motor that's located in the firebox. Now I have the shell off of the frame. We have the shell in the foreground here and the frame in the background. I'm going to roll this over and show you some of the wiring as it comes from Sunset. Now these 2 wires I've already cut away from their connections in the locomotive to make it easier to handle. But these 2 wires go forward into the shell, and they're for the headlight and the marker lights, which are light emitting diodes. Now in these lines, Sunset has installed 1/4-inch quick disconnects that are sometimes called fast-ons in the electronics industry. And they're very large and they're very difficult to snake alongside this motor inside the firebox area here, and it makes for a very, very tight fit. So I'm going to replace these large quick disconnects with a smaller battery quick disconnect. This is a SBC1 battery connector from All Electronics, and this is the SBH1, which is the mating 2-pin header. Okay, these are polarized, so you shouldn't be able to insert them backwards. And this small fastener will be a whole lot easier to snake around the motor than these 2 larger quick disconnects fasteners. Now why are these quick disconnects here? These quick disconnects are here so that when you take the shell off of the frame, you can separate them at the quick disconnects and not cut the wires free like I've done here, and put the shell totally aside so that you can work on the frame alone. So that's one of the things that we're going to do going forward. Okay, as you can see here, I've cut away the quick disconnects that were attached to the headlight wires. So those are sitting off here to the side. As you can see, once you do that, there's not too much left of these wires, so be a little bit careful. I've cut and stripped them. I've stripped them carefully so I didn't cut the wires back anymore. Make sure you support these wires as you're stripping them so you don't pull them out of the locomotive shell. Now here again is the matching 2-pin header that matches the 2-pin connector we have in the tender. I've soldered wires onto the header I've stripped their opposite ends. Now before we do anything else, we're going to feed these wires through, let's see if you can see this, move a little bit more light over here. Feed these wires through this opening, which is at the back of the locomotive shell under the movable deck plate, bridge plate actually, and you want to feed those through there, because once you've soldered them on, you don't want to have them coming up and around through the locomotive frame. Okay, the connections have been made, and I hope you remembered to put the heat shrink tubing on the wires before you made the solder connection. There's nothing worse than to have to undo a solder connection because you forgot the heat shrink tubing. Now what I'm going to do with these wires, now that they're connected, is I'm going to take them and stuff them inside. Let's see if I can get a little bit better light here. I'm going to stuff them inside the Loco shell, and then attach them with masking tape. And the reason for that is I want them well out of the way. Probably run one up one side of the firebox and the other one up the other side. I want them well out of the way of the motor when I put the frame back, when I put the shell back on the frame. Because as you can see here from the motor has a flywheel at this end, and you don't want anything rubbing against the flywheel, because eventually it will abrade through the insulation and cause a short of some type, and we certainly want to avoid that. Over on the frame side, I've already soldered on gray and orange wires to the motor terminals matching the DCC color code, but this frame also needs some remedial work as well. There's a tiny little eyelet here and a tiny screw, like a 0090 screw, which is actually where the locomotive picks up power from the right-hand rail. I mean, it's picking up power from the right-hand rail, and this is the attachment point on the frame where that power was sent back to the tender. And they provided this tiny little piece of wire which promptly broke, given Oriental soldering skills. Promptly broke, and it too has a very large 1/4 inch fast on. So we're going to replace these with the matching header for the 4-pin connector that we put on the tender, and we'll do all that work, and I'll show you how that goes in a subsequent segment. Now we're likely to see some continuity errors that I mentioned in the introduction. On previous attempts to hook up the decoder, I had put gray and orange wires onto the motor leads, and I had hooked up a red wire to the eyelet that attaches to the frame to replace the very thin wire that came with from the Orient. In addition, I have red and black wires already attached going forward in the body shell to the headlight and marker lights. So all that work has been done in previous segments, which you may or may not see in the edited video. I'm pretty sure you will. So now what we're going to do is hook up the new final connectors to all of these wires. So we have the let me see if I can get this where it's not with something cluttering the background. The orange and gray connector that has the male pins that will eventually hook up to the orange and gray wires for applying motor power. The 2-pin connector, which is going to hook up to the headlight wires going into the body shell, and the 1 red wire connector, female in this case, that's going to take the motor power forward. Now before any of these wires are connected, they must be threaded through the opening in the bottom skirt of the locomotive. You may not be able to see this may be too dark, but there's an opening in the back face of the locomotive shell. All the wires have to be threaded through there, connected to all of these wires, insulated with heat shrink tubing, and then I'll come back and show the wires all dressed off. In the previous segment, I dressed the wires coming from the motor lead to go down and around the motor, because this is a flywheel here for the motor, so we have to make sure that everything avoids the flywheel. Here are the wires dressed off. Each individual coil of wire, each individual wire has been coiled up, and then the coils have been tied down to the frame of the locomotive with a tie wrap. So let's zoom in here so you can get a better look at what I've done. Now, it may well be, I'm certain that this tie wrap here will show when the locomotive is assembled, but I can touch that up with black paint or black magic marker. We'll see how much of this shows through under the firebox of the locomotive, under the cab of the locomotive when it's reassembled. But hopefully this will work out well. Okay, the locomotive is back together, and it took quite a bit of nipping and tucking to get all those wires stuffed in under the cab. Now, I left the wires a little bit long. My advice, if you try this installation, will be to cut those down considerably shorter than the length I made them. I may in fact go in later and cut those shorter. Now, I've had this locomotive apart a few times already, and one bit of advice is where the handrails fit down into the pilot deck, make sure that those wires are in the holes drilled for them in the pilot deck as you reinsert the shell on top of the frame. If you don't physically guide them in there, then they'll wind up here interfering with the coupler cut lever, and that obviously won't look right. So now on to the layout. The locomotive came up on address 3 just as it's supposed to. On the programming track, it readily took address 4470, which is the cab number. As you can see, the headlight turns on and off, so the functions are working. And now I'm going to start this off at the slowest speed step to give you an idea of the slow motion capability, and I've made no adjustments to the Digitrax decoder. Next speed step. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.